Regulated.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I used to regulate alcoholic beverages, casino gaming, and tobacco. Now together, we're regulated.
We're back this week with one of my favorite people in the cannabis industry, somebody who I've known a very long time, Ryan Fingerhut, who has had a really fun, interesting progression through the world of cannabis consulting. And he's one of the guys who, when I first kind of learned about the industry and worked on some applications, it was with Ryan. And so life has kind of come full circle. And Brian, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Thanks. So hello, my name is Ryan Fingerhut, and I am the Director of Business Development for Global Go. I am an attorney out of Washington, soon to be barred here in California, where I'm physically sitting right now, though I split my time between California and Florida. I have been in the application writing space and in the cannabis compliance space since 2014, where I got my start in Washington as a newly admitted attorney. Fell into application writing. From there, created compliance schemata in the state of Washington and then in the state of California. Primarily, I practiced on the West Coast for the first 2 years, and then in 2016 started branching out onto East Coast projects, which is how I found my way back to Florida, which is my home state.
So Ryan and I know each other from law school, and we reconnected in the cannabis industry. And it's actually a really funny story how we reconnected. So at the time, my best friend is this Bulgarian, is a gigantic Bulgarian guy who I got an MBA with. And at the time, so I was a lawyer, practicing lawyer, going and getting an MBA at Boston. And I met Jeko, who's a business strategist, development guy. He works at like a big international company right now. But we were looking at cannabis, and we could both write. We both kind of strategic, and so we started thinking about doing cannabis applications and breaking into that world. Problem is, cannabis, especially like in 2014, is nobody trusts anybody. So you couldn't get meetings with people. It was business development was really hard. So Jeko ends up out in Seattle with his wife, who was working for Amazon at the time. And Jeko is reaching out to this woman who we met at a conference. And he finally gets a meet with her, right? But she's like, okay, Jeko, I'll meet with you, but I'm going to bring my lawyer with me to a sit down. And I was like, Jeko, this is not going anywhere. Trust me, as a lawyer, when someone tells you they're bringing a lawyer, it's like they're going to be very defensive with you. Jeko's like, oh, it's okay. Like we'll figure it out. It'll all be good. And so he says he's like sitting there at the table, and they're talking back and forth with Greta and her lawyer, and he's like, I'm here. I want to help you with your applications. Me and my friend, he's a very good guy. He's back in Boston. We can collaborate. We can help you in any way that you would desire. And so they're like, well, maybe, but we're interested in you. You're sitting here in Seattle. We don't know this other guy. And Jeko keeps bringing it back in. And eventually, towards the end of the conversation, he's like, this guy at the table, this lawyer, is like, all right, man, like, who is this lawyer? Like, who is this guy you're working with? Tell us about him, because he wouldn't drop it. And he's like, oh, he's this guy. He's named Christian. He's a lawyer from Florida. I am going to school with him at present. And Ryan at the time is like, wait, Christian, is he from Tallahassee? And they're like, yes, he's from Tallahassee. And so it turns out that like across the country in Seattle, Washington, breaking into the cannabis industry, my best friend is talking to one of my best friends from law school who, like, we had no idea that there was this connection. And then the rest is history.
Yeah, exactly. When they came in, actually, in 2014, it was very rare to find professionals with that type of, with MBAs and law degrees getting into the cannabis space. And usually the ones that wanted to poach our clients. So that was That was the big fear we had, was that they were coming in to basically learn
To steal your IP.
steal our trade secrets. And but when I found out that it was a good friend and the guy that I knew was a straight up person, it made the whole situation much easier to work with.
In five words or less, describe right now how you're feeling about Florida's cannabis market this session.
5 words. I would say that I am hopeful but watchful.
Hopeful but watchful. That's
Hopeful but
cautiously
watchful.
optimistic. That's nice. That's
I
good.
I am cautiously optimistic. I've seen some ideas and bills floated that I like, and so I generally think that people are thinking the right things. Whether or not we move forward with them, that will be the test.
Have you seen the murmur about what the most likely bill to actually move this session would be, which is the THC cap legislation? Have you seen the news and the coverage on that?
I have. I'm very hopeful that that doesn't pass. I think that that goes backwards. You know, arbitrarily capping THC at 10%. I think that, especially in a medical environment like Florida's, that should be left between the doctor and the patient. I also think that that takes away a lot of some of the better products that are available out there for patients, and I think it's sort of an arbitrary way. I think that the state would be better set to maybe standardize dosing a little bit better, and testing of the dosage, than to try to arbitrarily get between a patient and their physician.
Yeah, we had Andrew Friedman on last week, who is the old marijuana czar for Colorado, and he's doing some private equity. He's into other stuff now, but one of the things that we talked about is laying the fundamentals, kind of the foundations for a mature industry. And one of the benefits of the industry is it's predictable. Everybody's on the same page. It looks familiar to businesses, to patients. Like, people know how to interact with it. On the other side, regulators know how to regulate it. And for a new market, so I get all of the medical issues, right? And I think that's very well covered, and I don't need to rehash that stuff here. But for me, from a business perspective, you have this new cannabis industry in Florida. The worst thing you could do to it is basically say to a company, go ahead and destroy all of your existing crops, start from the embers on a whole new genetics, and do something and execute something that will take 10 to 12 months to execute a full transformation for a company that's actually on it and doing well. The supply shock that would cause in Florida. Now, I get the policy decision. If that's really the way you want to do it, that's one thing. But to force the industry this early on into that kind of supply shock, that would be devastating.
I absolutely agree. For one thing, I think that that would be very short-sighted. After all, cannabis can be manufactured, and therefore artificially, you can lower the THC. So forcing them to destroy their entire crop would just be a pointless economic loss.
It's because of the raw flower, right? So that's a big component of these guys' business, and you can't. I mean, you can't Frankenstein monster a flower, right? That it comes out, it has the THC it has, and so
you can breed and monitor and perhaps take the crop down early as a way to artificially counter that. But yeah, I agree. It definitely becomes a lot harder, though. The basis, I think, for CBD and hemp right now is that you can breed certain ways, but that takes generations, and to your point, would set the industry back quite a lot.
So you're in Florida now. How long have you been back in the state?
So I've been back in the state since May 1st of 2019. I am splitting my time right now between California and Florida. I'm primarily in Florida and on the East Coast, but I'm spending about a week a month back in California, where I still have quite a bit of clients through my company.
Talk about how you got into the cannabis industry and how that transition happened for you.
Sure. So the transition actually happened for me sort of accidentally. I moved to Seattle and became a newly admitted attorney there, mainly because in my travels during college, I'd really liked that area of the country and decided that's where I wanted to settle. So I was a newly admitted attorney, but I had no alumni network, no real friends or anything like that. So I was doing a lot of contract work as an attorney. One of those contract works was for a chain of naturopathic clinics, the Hope Clinics, based in Seattle, where I helped with some contracts and with some HIPAA compliance. The owner of that clinic, the naturopathic clinics in Seattle at the time, were primarily the ones who were writing the recommendations for cannabis use for the medical patients at that time. And the owner was very active in the cannabis political space, Greta Carter. And she was I-502, which was the recreational laws there in Washington, had just passed. And she was in the process of getting her own cultivation and processing company up. And she asked me to assist a bit with the formation of that company, as well as with final review of the application for that company. We were the, I believe, 76th license granted in the state of Washington. Through that process, and because of Greta's political acumen, we were invited to participate in some of the applications, medical applications down in first Las Vegas and then in Sparks, Nevada, Sparks being the sister city of Reno, Nevada. And everything sort of took off from there. I definitely saw the opportunity. I actually have a degree in criminology, and so was very familiar with the injustices of the drug war and the harms that it had caused on society. So I was very motivated to get into cannabis and to help with standardizing it and making it a regulated commodity. But I did actually get into the cannabis space, not because I particularly intended to, but because the opportunity presented itself and I jumped on it.
I mean, we're talking, this is like 2013, 2014. Okay.
Yeah.
When you're staring up at that in 2014, what was your vision for how that was going to roll out, and kind of what excited you about the market then?
So what excited me about the market then was the sheer opportunity. For instance, I was a newly admitted attorney. I've been barred in the state for less than a year, and I was having an immediate impact on the laws and how they were being interpreted. I would talk to enforcement agents and officers and people at the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board, as it's now called, and I would discuss with them the very loose regulations that had first been put out. I don't want to say loose because they did a poor job. It was just loose because there was a lot of missing information because it was a brand new industry and people didn't really understand how it was going to work yet. And I was able to have immediate impact on how the agency was interpreting those regulations. So that's what really attracted me to it. And I'm sorry, what was the rest of your question?
Like, if you can put yourself back in 2014 and you're looking at that, like, what did you think about what you were doing? Like, how did you feel about the cannabis industry at the time?
So at the time, I felt that it was really, really great. I was meeting, so Greta Carter, my partner, she was well established in the Seattle cannabis space. And so I was meeting all of these people like Greta. Greta, her background was in banking, and she came to the cannabis space after her real estate investments suffered under 2008. And that's what I was finding more and more as I entered what was the medical market and was quickly becoming the regulated market in Washington. These were normal business people. These were farmers. These were small business owners, just everyday people. And they were facing the threat of prison for doing what any other farmer or retail salesman could do. So I really, at first, when I got into the cannabis industry and I was very young, I saw this really as a sort of cottage industry, sort of the way you would look at, say, small batch beers, small batch alcohols. I very quickly developed an understanding that this would go big, that this would go corporate, though I will admit I did not foresee it advancing quite as rapidly. By the time I was done with the Vegas applications, I had started to get a very good whiff of where things were headed, how big business was going to be able to come in here very quickly, and how attractive it was to those big investors. For instance, the first clients I had never smoked cannabis, maybe once or twice in college, and had no real interest in it, but they saw it as a business. And I don't want to say that to badmouth them. A lot of people in the industry seem to think that people who don't smoke cannabis don't have any business in it. I disagree. I think that if you have an appreciation for the product and you don't look down on your customer base, then you have every right to be in the space. And I was very happy to work with people I did. But yeah, I saw where this was headed, though I did not think it would head here quite as quickly. Also did not see the investment topia that happened a year or two ago.
That was something that I was seeing over on the East Coast. The application game for someone who could write and someone who had a business sense to be able to put these competitive applications together, it seemed very clear that was going to be, at least for the next few years, like a very big industry. And there are a lot of people that have made a lot of money off of writing cannabis applications. And it's been interesting to see how that's shifted, right? Because back in the day, back in like the heady days of Greta and Fingerhut, like stomping around Washington, right? You could get 10-15% of a company, a couple $100,000 for writing an application, right? Which is completely changed to now, where getting points, getting equity is a lot harder, whereas you can, and it's more competitive to write these applications. But talk about like, how did you kind of figure out your way through your first application that you were writing?
So the first full application that I did was Nevada's medical application, and honestly, it was one bite at a time. I had the benefit of working with my partner Greta. She had done a Washington application, which was not merit-based, so there were some significant differences. But I also had from my legal background, I had technical writing. I have a degree in creative writing as well. So,
which is very important for a cannabis application. Just for our audience to be clear.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's exactly how I tackled it. I first tackled it with my technical skills. I went through the regulations and the laws line for line and made sure that I had something in my standard operating procedures and my application to address every one of those. And then from there, I went to work, beefing things up, doing research, talking to specialists in security, in inventory management, basically finding out everything I could so that I could beef it up from the base of the regulations and turn it into something that will win an application.
One of the primary reasons why I wanted to have you on to talk about the cannabis industry is because you come at it from a application writer and application consultant's perspective, which is, to me, where I cut my teeth and where I'm very interested in it. And it's still a kind of a very good business today as states continue to expand out. And so can you talk about like what that is, what a merit-based application is, and why it's important, why it has been important to the development, the history of the cannabis industry in the U.S.?
One of the things to understand is that there are two, at the very, very high macro level, there are two basic types of applications. There's what I sort of think of as the standard application, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of a business license, for the most part, and what they think of when they think of a driver's license. Meet the requirements and you will get a license and you will be able to move forward. Then there's the merit-based application, and this is what you see in a lot of states, where basically we're going to give out 19 licenses, and so it doesn't matter whether or not you qualify. I mean, well, of course it matters, but that's the bare minimum. Then it's a competition to see who puts forward the best pitch. And so, to give a perfect example, Washington is a standard application. So is California. These are places where if you can tell them how your business will meet the regulatory requirements, you will get a license, you will be able to move forward. We had a client who just recently wanted to go forward with a application in Illinois. This was a successful business, retail business owner in the state of Washington. They completed their application the way that they would have if it was Washington, a standard application. They hired me to give it a review, give it a few edits, maybe beef it up a little bit, a few weeks out before the deadline. When I looked at the application and I realized it was a standard application, to give you an example, there was around just over 200 pages that you could possibly complete for the state of Illinois, their page cap. And the application that I was asked to review was 60 something pages. And so I immediately called them and told them, look, I understand, that you guys know what you're doing and talking about because you've been doing it successfully. And I understand that your application meets all of the requirements for the law, but there's no way that in this short period of time, I'm going to be able to give you an application that I think has any chance of winning. And the reason for that is that the states that are looking for merit-based, they do not want a proliferation of cannabis. You can argue free market principles, and I often do, but at the end of the day, they do not want a war, a business war between different people within their state when it comes to cannabis. At least not at this time. Oftentimes because of their fear of the federal issues, but that's where it is. So they want the best applicants. And so the idea is not just to meet the requirements like the standard application, but in fact to impress them. It's not that I'm going to have a security guard on my property 24/7. It's that my security guard is a combat veteran who was an ex-police officer and, is going to do a better job than anybody else's security guard. And that's the real difference between a merit-based and a standard application. You have to basically prove that you're better than everybody else, or at least better than the other. If there's 30 people applying and there's only 15 spots, better than the next 15 guys.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting to watch how these things have evolved even over the last, say, like 5 years ago. Competency, just a clear writing, competency, some graphics, and some degree of legitimacy, which was difficult then because you were coming out of an illegal market. So it was hard to finagle like, oh yeah, we have this really experienced grower, when it was you legally couldn't have done that in the state before. Whereas now, like on an Illinois application, you can have someone who's credibly been growing since 2012 in a completely legal market. But now we're in a whole different world, right? Where everyone can hire someone to write competently. Everyone can Google cannabis SOPs and can just rip those SOPs off. So it's this bottleneck at the very top between where you have to go for every possible edge you can. And it comes down to, when I talk to clients about how they should be writing these things, it's specific experience, specific people, the number of years, the number of strains, all of these things end up having to come down because when they end up being very important, because when these graders ultimately have to stack these things next to each other, they're so close together in fundamentally what they can do or what they tell you they can do. But you have to objectively point to some reason why candidate A is better than candidate B. And sometimes the silliest little things can put you over the top.
Absolutely. I often tell my clients that in my experience with merit-based applications, the spread between the top scoring applicant and the applicant that, is the guy who's just below the cutoff point is going to be 5 points or less. The one application I ever lost, and I was 3 spots lower, I lost by 0.02 points. So it's an extremely, extremely stressful process. I was telling that to my clients in Illinois when we were debating whether or not we needed to make sure that there was a veteran on the team for the 5 points that they were giving for that. And I would explain to them, listen, there's going to be other people with veterans on their teams. And quite frankly, if we can't get those points, we have a very significant issue because everybody's going to do their best, and the only people who are going to get this are going to be the ones that are within less than a point of each other. So we can't afford to leave anything on the table.
The last 18 months, I think diversity has kind of become one of those things where first of all, if you don't have a diverse application and you don't have somebody with credible diversity chops, you're going to lose, because you're going to get crushed. And when these applications are so close, you can't just blow a section or a significant number of points.
Yep.
And then you avoid getting crushed, but then you now have to compete against the best of the best at the top. So it's like you have to have the most chops in order to win those applications. So I kind of sometimes compare it to like an Olympic track athlete, whereas like 2014, if you were an Olympic caliber track athlete, you were basically running against a couple people who were kind of at your level, and then like the general population. You could just crush them based on your talent alone. But now it's like if you win by 0.2 of a second, and everybody's kind of like boom, 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 coming right in after each other. So like Missouri is a great example of this, right? So Missouri has 6-7 pages of results, and you can see the winners and the losers are separated by like fractions. They're separated by the closest of margins, and it's like this spread. There's no like tier, right? So it's your spread, and there's no real clear differentiator between the winners and the losers. It's just where they stopped issuing licenses, and those are multi-million-dollar impacts for who gets the licenses and who doesn't, and can really make a very big impact on these businesses' bottom lines. And so hiring groups like yours that know how to write an application and put these things together is becoming more and more of it's changing from a nice to have to an absolutely mandatory thing that you have to have in order to win applications these days.
I generally agree. I have lately seen the trend where people in my industry who generally used to be freelance or private contractors the way that I am are starting to be taken in-house by some of the bigger brand names.
Yeah.
But generally, I do agree. And I don't even know if you could really hold that up as an example, since they're really just grabbing the talent out there and bringing it in-house.
You know whose career I really love has been Chris Crane with Forefront, where you had these guys who could write applications, and they were just like, I don't want to write applications for other people. I want to write them for ourselves and just build our own empire based on our ability to go in and kick other people's asses in competitive applications.
Yep. I am very admirable of that. It's actually kind of funny, since I technically went the opposite way, since the first applications I worked on with my partner were for our first business, and I took a minor equity position through her of that business. And then we sort of got into working with the other big cannabis businesses, primarily at that time because we were Washington based, and funding in Washington was and still is a very significant challenge because some of the regulations there are about funding sources. But yeah, I think that Chris Crane, well, there are a lot of times when I am frustrated with a client, and I think to myself, I wish this was my own business, that I could just make the decision I wanted to.
So you mentioned Washington and kind of where they are now. One of the interesting things about the last decade is that Washington was right with Colorado in the legalization movement, right? They were 1A and 1B. They legalized on the same day. Why do you think Colorado has had this reputation as this kind of mature keystone market, and Washington has been a little bit more of a less respected market? I don't know if that's the word I want to use, but it's a word I'll use.
I would say that Washington has not matured as fast as Colorado. And I think a lot of that, in my opinion, has to do with stabilization. Colorado really made a big effort right off the bat to listen to their industry and the problems that they were having, and they made tweaks in order to address those issues. And you've seen, I just recently read a report in MJ Business that Colorado prices are now considered stable when it comes to the flower market. Washington is not there. I'm not saying that Washington did not listen to what was happening from the business side of things, but I think that they, one, were a little bit greedy on the tax dollars. It took them too long to adjust to the damage that and please understand, Washington had effectively a 50% tax on flour and a 75% tax on manufactured product. So it was a pretty severe tax. Also, they've had some major issues with traceability. They've changed traceability systems. At one point, they were talking about getting rid of their traceability system. Not sure where that is right now, but they've had some very major upheavals, and those happened later on than Colorado's. So Colorado basically, they put their market out within the first couple of years, they made the major changes that they saw were needed because this was a new market and they didn't really understand. Washington was slower to adapt. They were slower to be willing to accept that the first pass that their legislature and their regulators did with a complete vacuum of information, the way that Colorado and they had when they first started their regulated system, they were just less willing to go back and make the hard needed changes, and so they're behind in Colorado when it comes to market stabilization, in my opinion.
So when you get hired onto an application team and you're charged with putting an application together and structuring a competitive application, how do you go about doing that?
Really two ways. Before I even get into the application, because I have to give them a basic, I have to give a proposal and a pitch on what I'm going to be paid. I go through the application and where the regulations, I go through the application itself, through the scoring rubric and through the regulations, assuming that all three of those things are available. And I will basically create an outline for what I think it's going to take in order to put together a winning application. That's sort of how I base my proposals, because that gives me an idea of what the type of man hours that it's going to take to put forward a winning application. And of course, as we all know, these things change while in progress. You learn new things, and so that's usually only an outline of the hours and a prediction, but I'm generally at this point pretty good at coming within 10-20%. The next thing I do is I assess my client and my client's team. What resources do they have? Do they have security experts on the team? Do they have inventory experts on the team? Depending on the license type we're going after, do they have a subject matter expert on the team that's capable of really shining? I find do they have is this an experienced operator in other states, or is this somebody who's brand new? And if they're brand new, what have they done previously that I can, put forward? For instance, I'm working with a client right now who's about to get a retail business. He has never owned or run a cannabis business, but he's owned and run multiple liquor stores and gas stations. So he's used to the regulated alcohol market. So I basically figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of my team are. And then once we're signed, I talk with the client and we go about creating a plan to better emphasize the strengths and to shore up the weaknesses. If we don't have the experience on the team, let's go out and let's find that experience and hire it onto the team. If we need more chops when it comes to charitable contributions and whatnot, let's find somebody who's got a long and storied history of working with local charities to join the team and sort of run up our civil arm, or our community arm. And that's normally how I go about it.
When you're out hunting for new clients, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the sophisticated clients looking for that you've experienced in an application writer and an application team?
Well, first, for performance. Your performance record when you're an application team, assuming you're not new, is a very big deal. What I find more and more when I deal, especially with the big clients, is they see applications as extremely risky. It's a huge investment, and there's actually a very small percentage of return, taking everything out, the talent on the team and all of that. Although I often tell my clients that honestly, when you look at how many people applied, you can cut that in half, because in my experience, about half of them didn't put forward an application that had any chance or had a serious technical flaw. But they're really, really interested in hedging that risk, to the point where I've had several clients who've offered to pay me almost double what I originally asked, assuming that the majority of that payment came only upon condition of winning. Not saying that I always accepted those types of contracts, but they're very, very interested in the amount of risk that they're putting their money to, and any type of indication that you have the ability to hedge that risk is going to be a major factor in whether or not they go with you.
And how has your fee structure changed over the years, and in how you do business with these cannabis companies?
Like you said, when we first got started, we were taking small pieces of equity. Part of that was because of the risk. Part of that was because nobody really understood where the cannabis space was going. So actually what's ended up happening is our flat fee pricing has gone up. Especially as the market gets more sophisticated. There's just more and more work that goes into these applications. The applications themselves, I find, are getting larger. But on the other hand, we're not taking any equity. Nowadays, people understand that equity in a major cannabis company is worth far more than, the extra $10,000 I might charge you for not getting a percentage of equity there. Also, like I said, the win bonus has basically become standardized. When I first got started, it was happening a lot, but it was not the standard. Now, more and more, when I'm talking about a merit-based application, one of the applications that's costing, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to put through, you're generally looking at, a significant portion of that fee being in a win bonus, say 10-20%.
And talk about that piece that you just mentioned is the budget, right? So when you're talking to a new client or you're talking to an existing client, what should a company that wants to be competitive going into a big competitive market, what should they expect to pay to secure the people and resources that they're going to need in order to put forward a competitive application?
Well, that's a huge swing, Christian, just because some states require real investment in property and infrastructure as part of the application itself. For instance, Florida, with their very short turnaround for once they grant the application and once you're supposed to start getting your facility up and running, versus say New Jersey, where we were able to simply put a small lease in place that really was freely terminable if the application was lost. So taking out the investment potential in real estate, I would say you're probably looking at anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 just in getting the right people on your team, in the application writing itself, which, like I said, is going to take 1,000+ hours, in getting the resources in place, in getting minor contracts in place. You're going to need to negotiate those contracts, which means you're also going to need people on the ground, probably have fees to people who are willing to be put on the application. Even if they're looking for a future job later, there's work that they're going to have to do up front for that application. So I would say that you're definitely looking at low to mid six figures, and that's without taking into account whether or not you're going to have to make an investment in tangible assets like real estate.
Yeah, and the people are a sneaky thing, and it's interesting that you mentioned it. So it's not only the ancillary stuff. So like the lawyers, the accountants, the consultants that you're going to have to pay just to create an application.
Mm-hmm.
But so when you're assuming it's not, well, even if it's an anonymous application, you still have to have fundamental people with experiences, even if their actual name doesn't appear right. But the problem with people is people are like a fixed and limited resource, especially people with industry experience. And so this is something that I'm going to be really interested to see what happens in Florida, because regardless of whether it stays vertical or breaks up, if there's a competitive application, you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be applying for licenses in Florida. But there's only so many people, say, that like have very high tier, respectable experience, like managing a processing facility. And these guys all want those people. And so you're going to have to pay those people in order for them just to like feature their experience on the application, even if they're not like wedded to the company. And so that's something that has become a new thing, which is this pot of money that's basically just like paying people to license their name and their experience and their resume on their application. Tell me the CIA agent story.
So just to go over some of the things that I've seen in the cannabis industry, we had a client purchase a decent amount of vaping hardware from another cultivator, another producer in the state of Washington. This person was paid by check. They signed a contract. It was actually a rather small amount. It was a few $1,000s, and maybe and they actually way overpaid. It was a few $1,000s and maybe 500 to 700 vaping cartridges to be filled with oil. Well, turns out that the person who sold that to him actually didn't own it, or it had been shipped to them and they were supposed to pay for this, and they told the person who they were supposed to pay that in fact they had been robbed by my client, and my client had stolen this vaping hardware and go to them for the money. So this person calls my client, and I end up talking to the guy, and he tells us that we said that, or we apparently stole this. We of course deny it and tell him we can offer you proof. But in the story, he's basically telling us that he is in fact a undercover. I think it was a CIA agent. Maybe it was an FBI agent, though I think it was CIA, because he basically said that he was undercover, he'd done stuff in Africa, and he was going to, use his governmental powers to come after us and hold us accountable under federal law for cannabis dealing if we didn't, give him his money. And of course, the first thing, red flag, is why would a CIA agent break his cover over a few $1,000s worth of hardware?
Was he wearing cargo shorts while he was telling you that he was in the CIA? I picture, when you tell the story, I'm picturing a guy in cargo shorts.
I don't know. I never actually physically met the guy. I think he was out of Colorado, and we were in Washington, but I did talk to the guy via email and once via phone. So he makes all these accusations. And
so he's sending you emails, like in writing, saying, I'm in the CIA?
I think the CIA was on the phone, but in the emails, he referenced his governmental powers. So, of course, I do some research on this person because, I'm still relatively new. I think this is all BS, but you never want to just assume that. Turns out that this person, he'd gotten into trouble socially for beating up a dog in public. He had was being sued and this is how I found out all of this. He's being sued for basically airplane theft. And so I go and start doing. Yeah, he was being sued for airplane theft.
Airplane.
And he didn't actually steal the plane. He chartered a plane, flew to Africa where he was involved in gold smuggling. And that plane was then, he was arrested. The plane was impounded and seized by the African country. I think it was Zimbabwe, but don't hold me to that. And held. And then when he got back to the States after serving his prison term for gold smuggling, he was sued by the owners of the plane, who basically said that you grabbed my plane, you used it in a criminal transaction. Now I don't have the plane anymore, so you're responsible for it.
See, this is the stuff I miss and I don't miss, right? So this is the thing that, like, people these are the experiences that you could only get from like mid 2010s US cannabis. Like, you dealt with people who would steal airplanes and smuggle gold. I mean, like, it's getting like I talked to Tony, my co-host, a little bit about this. I went to MJ BizCon in December, so just a few months ago, and you mentioned this earlier on the pod. It's just a theme. I think everyone understands that this is a very corporate. This is the amount of turtlenecks and like cardigans and like. One of the things I tell people is, like, the number of belts that you see in this thing is just exponentially higher than when I went in like 2015. So because these companies have gone public, so many of these companies have gone public, they really have to watch who they hire, who they associate with, who they contract with. And so, and the money has gotten bigger, right? So it's departing that area where the mid-tier entrepreneur can really make a big splash. Mm-hmm. It's more, you can either make a niche play that you hope to grow, kind of like Hollywood. Like, you can make the small budget Blair Witch Project type of thing that maybe will turn into this scrappy project that becomes big, or you just blow it out the door and you're running $100-200 million company. But these mid-tier things are harder and harder to establish. Not that they don't exist, but just to build it, right?
I agree.
And so the plucky entrepreneurs, the guys who think that they could make $5 million off of the cannabis industry from like who were former gold smugglers, you just don't run into those type of people with the frequency that you used to.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So, I mean, have you noticed any other kind of macro changes over the last 5 years in cannabis?
So yes, I have. I've noticed quite a few. One of the major ones has been the way that, and I think this has to do with the customer base shifting in cannabis. When I first got into cannabis, the vast majority of cannabis was sold to people who are cannabis users regularly, and they had a certain amount of expertise, the way that you would think of somebody who drinks, who's really into wine. has an expertise. They have preferred brands. They are looking for certain types of potency. They are very, very picky about the quality. As cannabis has gone more mainstream, people are more focused on branding. People are more focused on packaging. They still care about things like flavor and whatnot, but they're not as, already ingrained. So I've seen a real focus on cannabis from, what used to be the old school things that people would look at to more of a modern commoditization of the product and, looking at the product more as, say, a widget as opposed to the way that, I don't know what the term for a person who's really into wine is. Is that wino? Or
A
somebody who's,
wino?
yeah, I think that's a drunk,
I
but
think wino is pejorative.
yeah. Well, somebody,
I'm like a sommelier, but I guess they're the
sommelier,
ones who
yeah,
serve them. No,
yeah, a
what is
connoisseur, a
a
connoisseur.
connoisseur?
A
Yeah.
connoisseur. So we've definitely shifted from the market primarily being cannabis connoisseurs to the market being primarily cannabis occasional users and people who, like cannabis and care about the flavor, but they're not going to sit there and debate the differences between, say, sativa and indica or different types of strains or different brand names.
Yeah, yeah. So it seems if cannabis were cookies, right? It seems we've gone from the kind of home baked mom and pop where we're in like a the fancy donut stage where you can go into you could go to Dunkin' Donuts and get a donut, or you could go to like these specialty shops where you get like the maple bacon donuts, right? But the next and kind of final form is the Oreo stage where you just have mass produced commoditized consumer packaged good products, right, that are plastic wrapped and shipped all over the country and are basically indistinguishable from one another and have that kind of mass market appeal, but relatively low quality compared to a Dunkin' Donuts donut, right?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, we've gone from, I mean, there will always be space. Mrs. Fields is still out there in malls and people still go and buy that fresh baked cookie, but the vast majority still want to eat the Oreos. It's more convenient, it's cheaper, it's more everyday. And, the industry as a whole has shifted to appeal to those types of customers.
Right. So obviously, when you go around the country and you do this a fair amount because you consult all over the U.S., how far the industry has been able to progress down that road of modernization and efficiency and scale depends a lot on the regulatory structure.
It
And
does.
so
And if I could add, also how quickly the regulatory structure can adapt to new business models and new technologies.
that's fair. That's a very I think that's a very underrated component is not only how flexible the industry is, but how flexible the regulator is, right? Because you as a regulator, when you are presented with a novel challenge, the easiest thing to do is just to say stop it. We're gonna figure this out, right? The harder thing to do is to fix that airplane while it's still in the air, right? And not shut
Hmm.
everything down, but to allow it to continue and to stabilize. And so there has to be some degree of trust in order for that to happen between the regulator and the industry. So in that note, in that vein, um, which regulatory structure do you think has gotten it the most right? Like where are the regulatory structures in the country that you think are doing it really well today?
So that's difficult to say because pretty much every regulatory structure has, its pluses and its minuses. For instance, I personally prefer the more West Coast style of the standard application, more open. I believe in capitalism and I believe in the free markets. And so I think that overall and over time, the consumer is going to get the best quality product if we open it up to the free market. That being said, those markets also have tended to have a lot of suffering from glut. They've had that competition has bred on some unfortunate results when it comes to what the behavior of testing labs. So, overall, I do see the benefits also of a merit-based system. And for instance, I think Florida has done an excellent job when it comes to the addressing the medical concerns of the plant and making sure that it is treated, as a medical product with training for doctors and things of that nature. But overall, I would say, sort of to wrap back to where we started the whole conversation, I think Colorado's probably done it best out of all of them. Not to say that they don't have their flaws, because of what I said. They've been the most open to changing and adapting and learning from their mistakes. And I think with an industry as new as this one, and as still with as many unknowns as there still are in this one, that's the best type of system that you can create. Is not necessarily one that's perfect, but one that's able to more quickly fix its own mistakes.
So for you as a consultant, which is more profitable to work in? Is it more profitable for you to work in an open licensing model, or on these competitive merit-based applications in a limited structure?
Definitely merit based. That's where my talent, my track record really allows me to command a premium. There aren't a lot of people who've done what I've done for as long as I have. And so, supply, demand, there's a limited supply, so we can demand a higher price. That being said, when it comes to the ability for somebody like me to have a long term career in the space, either you have to branch out. For instance, I also do compliance auditing, performing, cannabis business compliance. But as far as, with a merit base, there are certain windows when you can work, and then there's a big girth, or there's a big amount of time where there's not a lot for you to do as an application writer, because there's not an application period available. So more open ones basically create the more standard long time work that really lets you create a long-term business.
Circling back to one of the topics that we mentioned earlier on about the fundamentals of creating a mature market. In your experience, what do you think a state needs to have in place in order to have a well-run regulatory system?
The first thing I would say is, when it comes to regulations and the laws, there needs to be an open or some type of feedback loop with the industry itself, as well as with community shareholders. Oftentimes I see, and this has gotten a lot better recently, but originally the industry was shut out of the regulatory side of things because there was this feeling that we would corrupt it, that because we had a personal, commercial, and financial interest in how those regulations were, that we had no place at the table, which I think is wrong, because it's the people who are being regulated who can tell you the real world effects of what some of your regulations are. For instance, in Washington, there was a requirement that you had to put into the traceability system who the driver of the vehicle was going to be at least 24 hours prior to the delivery going out. And if that driver got sick, got hurt, got into a car accident, and so couldn't start at the specified time, you had to cancel the whole delivery, and it would take you at least another 48 hours to get that delivery out there. Well, that, for obvious reasons, very quickly crippled distribution in the state of Washington. That was one of the areas where they did fix it within the first year, but it was definitely a nightmare for the first year, really being paranoid about, I have to plan everything out 24 hours in advance, and if anything goes wrong, I have to write the whole thing off as a loss. So I think it's really, really good to have feedback initially, so that you understand from the people who are going to actually have to live with these regulations what the consequence is going to be. And that's not necessarily saying that, you have to cater to them exclusively. Obviously, the regulator has a duty to the public and to the people who pass those laws to protect them from any unintended consequences or dangers or risks. But you also have to know what the unintended consequences of your regulation is going to be. The next big thing, and this may be because I've worked a lot in California, where we've very publicly had an issue with the black market, is enforcement. Once the regulations are in place, you need enforcement agents who are going to actively enforce this. You need a traceability system that's actually monitoring the cannabis, and people who are checking on that monitoring. You need people who are shutting down the black market, and are creating the type of regulatory environment where the people who are good actors are the ones who thrive. Because if you have an industry where you have a bunch of regulations out there, but nobody's actually enforcing them, what very quickly happens is that the people who are breaking the rules, the bad actors, get at the commercial advantage of cutting the corners, doing things cheaper, doing things unsafely.
Let me stop you and ask you a question about it.
Sure.
This is something I've been thinking a lot about for the last month or two, and that's the black market, right? So there's the regulated market and the black market, And then we have this thing, which the squishy term in the middle, which is like the gray market. And so just so we're on the same page, when I talk about the gray market, basically people who are operating within a regulated market, they're licensed or they're operating in a legal enough way that it's squishy, whereas the black market is expressly illegal. It's either people who are growing their own and just selling it to other people they know completely out of the regulated structure, or organized crime, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, a lot of these states that have moved forward with recreational, with adult use, legalized cannabis, we're not talking about a medical structure. And at that same timeline, they're introducing decrim and expungement and are dramatically reducing the criminal impact of possession charges or even low-level sale or distribution charges. So under that atmosphere, I think everybody agrees that black market in theory is bad, but like, how do you squeeze the black market when you're at the same time decriminalizing the things that you would arrest people for violating the law?
I don't think that that's necessarily as challenging as some might think, because there's already that system sort of already built into law. We've always addressed the user and the small time dealer versus the major commercial operator in the drug market based off of how we sentence people. Every state, usually an ounce or something like that gets a significantly different penalty if you have less than an ounce on you than if you have significantly more. We saw this with federal sentencing guidelines where, generally speaking, 99 plants or up was going to get you decades in prison. And if you had less than that, you were looking at, I'm not going to say that, 5 years in prison is nothing, but it's significantly less than 20.
Yeah, certainly not.
Yeah. So I think that that's how you have to really address it is, are we talking about commercial levels of cannabis, or are we talking about a very small amount of cannabis that is either personal use or maybe 3 or 4 people's worth?
But so here's the thing, right? Is that maybe on a grand scale, the small scale, very low level drug crimes, there has to be a huge multiplier effect for that to impact a regulated cannabis market producing at scale, right? But the other side of that, which I think, for as big as it is, gets kind of dismissed a little bit. But before, say like 1980, all the way through the early 2010s, right? But we had this regulated structure. There's no like legal permitting. There's no regulated industry. There's no regulated supply chain. But you have this very effective, efficient, syndicated network of distribution for illegal cannabis, right? And that is still very much functioning. And the way that it works is the drug is distributed through lower and lower levels, lower and lower amounts. And they understand that the lowest level of possession or distribution are going to get lower level crimes. And they're even, because the way that you would prosecute those drug rings is you would get the low level people and you would basically flip all the way up to get as high in the organization as you can. But when you basically eliminate any criminal penalties at the lowest end, how do you penetrate that drug network? Like, how do you actually break up a black market supply chain?
Well, I would say that you might still be able to go after them. Generally, illegal people in the black market, they can't go to the police, so there's gun charges and associated charges you can go after. But honestly, I think that you have to go after the demand rather than supply in that type of place. You need to one, make sure that you're not overtaxing or overregulating to the point where the costs for the people who are doing it the right way are so much higher than the black market that your average citizen basically says, okay, I'm willing to take the risk of buying illegally because it's half the cost. And this especially becomes important in medical states where somebody who's on chemo or whatnot and might be using more than your average recreational user, that can have a real impact on their bottom line. People can be forced to do what they have to do, especially since, at least to this point, though we'll see what happens with New Jersey's ruling, medical insurance does not cover recommended cannabis. The second is, I think there really needs to be a focus on the safety of regulated cannabis versus unregulated cannabis. One of the big issues right now with emphasizing that is because cannabis was unregulated until relatively recently, most people are familiar with either they've been used cannabis in the black market and were fine, or they know people who have, and so they're not particularly worried about the results. And one of the things that I tend to stress to people, especially to operators who used to operate in that system and are not coming in, is you have to realize this was an underground economy, so there was no feedback loop. Nobody knew if they were getting sick off of this guy's product or that guy's product. There was no way to really know. We're quickly learning, for instance, with the vaping crisis, that there are significant issues that can happen with cannabis. Everybody knows of black mold and things of that nature that can get into the cannabis itself. Now we're learning about hardware and manufacturing issues. One of the things that a lot of people don't really realize is there's also been some very risky behavior by the black market in the past that just didn't get a lot of press. As a, for instance, in California, they test cannabis for salmonella, which when I first heard of it, I thought was crazy because, you don't really think salmonella raw chicken. Well, as it turns out, when I did a little bit of research, the reason they test for salmonella in California is because somebody once smuggled a ton of marijuana in dead chicken carcasses up from Mexico, and a whole bunch of people got salmonella poisoning from their cannabis. And that's a story that isn't really widely known, but honestly should be, because these people who are doing the black market, they just want to get their money. They're not overly concerned with the health effects of what they're doing. Oftentimes, they're not really educated in what the potential health effects of what they're doing are. So people really should be more cognizant of that. And that's before we even get into what happens to an employee of a black market cannabis facility who, say, falls down and gets hurt and doesn't have workers' comp insurance and is basically depending on their employer to provide for their health care.
That was something that we talked about with Friedman. Friedman's response was similar. And it was basically that I think his quote was, if 99% of your efforts against the black market are not economic, that you're going to fail. And I think that is something that I'm kind of coming around to understanding, which is that I don't think that, given the current trajectory and the current framework, that like attacking the black market through basically the police power is how you stop it, because it was effective. It was extremely effective operating under the police power before we legalized cannabis, and it has just lowered those barriers from that perspective. So there's nothing that convinces me that under this framework we're going to be able to destabilize or destroy the black market through the police power. You beat them, I think, through economics and through communication. You make it more convenient, you make it more affordable, you make it more safe, you let people know that it's more safe, very bluntly. But so that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, what markets in the US right now are particularly interesting to you?
So the markets in the US that are really interesting to me, I'm looking towards the future of what happens to cannabis. I think that deschedulization or decriminalization at the federal level happens maybe not in the next year with the election coming up, but in the next 5. I truly do believe that. So I am focused on markets that I see great growth potential in, whereas, say, a few years ago, I was focused more on markets where I thought the population and the market itself was healthy enough to create a profitable business. So I'm really interested in any of the Northeast Seaboard. The population density up there, I think, really makes it a great place to have a business. You can, very easily branch out into other states once the federal issues bring down those state borders. All those states being close together, of course, you can very easily create a distribution network, a chain of retail stores, a cultivation center that's capable of supplying to that huge population center. I really like California, because California is the America's bed of the cannabis industry. There will always be brand recognition here with California as well when it comes to the ability to do outdoor grows and things of that nature. We just got a high concentration of talented people and an understanding of the product. Though I have heard and do agree that the Midwest might also be a good place if you're looking for solid large growth cultivation, though I think that the Midwest, in my personal opinion, will be probably more towards hemp. And then I actually really like Florida.
Everybody likes Florida.
Yeah, everybody likes Florida.
It's the sleeping giant.
It is. It is. I point out to people all the time, Florida, if you can get a license, because they are heavily restricted there, but if you can get a license, it allows you to create this huge infrastructure. And quite frankly, Florida is the only one in the Southeast right now that's really aggressively allowing people to do that. So once federal deregulation happens, aside from the amazing weather and great people in Florida, you're really going to be set up to grab the entire Southeast sector, because everybody else who's starting off in Georgia, where their medical is very restricted, or the Carolinas or Tennessee, they're just, they're going to take years to catch up to you.
Plus, this is short-term thinking, or I guess mid-term thinking. But if Florida legalizes adult use, so if it's no longer in a medical market, we're one of the tourism hubs of North America, because it's not just Disney World. It's Miami, it's the Keys, it's the beautiful city of Tallahassee that is a tourist beacon all over the world. People, if you're Japanese, right, or you're South Korean, or you're from, I don't know, Africa, from a country that doesn't allow cannabis consumption, like that was Colorado's thing for the longest time, was that it was like a tourist destination, still kind of is, but Florida is kind of that times 100. It's a worldwide tourist destination. I mean, millions and millions of people coming through who could be having their first experience with cannabis if that ever went rec. Just from like, not, I don't want to get into the social political things, just from purely an economic and marketing perspective, like that market size, it's not just the 20 million people, it's the millions of tourists we get in this state too.
Absolutely. And all you have to do is look at Las Vegas and how their medical market blew up because they accepted recommendations from other states. They were the first state to do that. In fact, I don't think there's many states that still do. They've had a huge impact on the medical sales that they were able to hit. And I think you're absolutely correct that that's a good thing about Florida. It's also great for branding. And one of the other things to point out is even going beyond national, once it becomes legal nationally, we all know that big business goes global very quickly in today's market. And Florida is, for all intents and purposes, America's pathway into the South America markets and into the Caribbean markets. And there's a lot of really great, Colombia, Peru, or not Peru, Uruguay. They're legalizing there, and they're going to be a great source for cheaper cannabis that you'll be able to ship into the United States, into Florida, which is all set up for it. Manufacture it there and sell it there, and as deregulation happens at the federal level, move it into the rest of the country.
Have you been to Planet 13 in Vegas?
I have, twice.
That's the future. I mean, that place is, for people who haven't been, Planet 13 is in Las Vegas. It's this like a complex. It's a dispensary, but it's more of like it's got like
it's an entertainment complex almost.
Yeah, it's got entertainment, it's got a bar, it's got like a restaurant, you can go get pizza, and then it's got this massive dispensary. And it's a lot of people. It's crazy how quickly these cannabis companies adopted the Apple Store floor plan and footprint for cannabis sales. But it's like you can go in, you enter a number as soon as you walk in, and it's like, basically, when I was there, it was like a 45-minute wait in order just to talk to a human being. Or you can kind of go through the express lane and you line up behind 40 people. But like that scale for a tourist hub for adult use is like, it cannot be underestimated. Not just the money you can make, the people you attract, the jobs you create. So I see stuff like that 20 years from now being, people looking at places like Miami and Orlando as, just as attractive as Las Vegas with a Planet 13 model. So if I gave you right now $1 million, all right, Fingerhut, here's a 7-figure check. Here's $1 million to go put to work in cannabis. You can invest it in yourself. You can invest it in a company. You can build your own company. What would you do with $1 million?
So with $1 million, in the cannabis space, it's actually not quite as much as I think most people would think, or as least as I normally would think in the space. So if I was to have $1 million, it would kind of depend a little bit on what sort of partnerships I would be able to put together, what sort of opportunities I would be able to find. One of the things that I think is not really being looked at hard enough, although that's definitely changing, is cannabis IP. You definitely see that in Canada in the medical world with some of these big public companies, but you're not seeing it as much at the local level. There are some people who are putting, or sorry, not at the local level, but at the smaller business sort of commercial level here in the States. I do know that there are several people who are trying to figure out how to create a cannabis edible that isn't as long-term lasting. I know that there are people that are trying to figure out, how to create the cleanest and best vape, things like that. I would probably try to find a company like that to invest in. Alternatively, I think that there's a lot of great markets. So I generally think of cannabis as sort of going from scalability to dependence upon a sort of a spectrum, with cultivation on one side being the highest scale, but also being probably the riskiest of investments, versus retail with the lowest ability to scale, at least per store, but also probably being the most easy to get a return out of. So if I was to look for a more safe investment, I would probably look for a retail in a jurisdiction that's just outside of the metropolitan area. One of the things you're really seeing in Miami, you're seeing in California and Seattle and New York, basically all across the country, is that the housing crises that are happening in our metropolitan areas are really pushing the middle class to commute farther. So I would find an area that I thought was an up and coming area, and I would put a retail into that space, because I find that the major metropolitan areas, for several reasons, are much more restrictive on your business model, are much more higher taxed, are much more difficult to work in. Whereas, the few retailers I have seen go out of business, other than for poor management, were because they were too rural to find a decent customer base. So I would probably look for a retail facility in that type of location. And then finally, I might invest, again, $1 million isn't enough to do this on its own, but I might try to find a company that was really looking towards the future. Like I said, I'm looking for what's going to happen once federal deregulation happens. So I would look to invest in a company that is building a national brand right now, is getting licenses in key states, is really not necessarily focused on branding, though branding is important, but actually on building a distribution network that's capable of capturing the country and serving, or at least serving a major part of the country once deregulation happens.
I can think of at least one of those in Florida right now.
Yeah.
Okay, same question, but if I gave you $100 million, how would you deploy that?
If I had $100 million, data, data or IP. IP is still definitely a big one, but some of these big tech companies, or even just going out to all of these different point of sale system companies that are collecting all of this data and bringing it all in. The cannabis market has definitely taught me what the weakness of a brand new market where nobody really understands what anything is, how much the average consumer will use, what you can expect in consumer growth, which products will be the most popular. All of this has 3-4 years worth of history, and even our understanding today is honestly nothing. Very few markets have. Colorado is the only market I know that people consider flower pricing to have been stabilized. So I think that any company that can really capture all of this and aggregate that data, either they can monetize that themselves, or they can sell that monetization to other people, or create programs based off of it. But I think that understanding the market, not just the micro markets of each jurisdiction in each state, but also the macro markets of how cannabis is evolving and why cannabis is evolving that way in these different states and in these different regulatory schemata, is going to be worth a ton of money, say a decade from now. And I think that that's the path to $1 billion really in this industry.
I really appreciate you coming in and talking, and I want to just kind of speak extemporaneously as we close out, is that a lot of people especially like young people I talk to, ask how they can break into the cannabis industry, how they can do something interesting. And one of the things that I tell them is that like it's hard work to get, but like if you don't have experience, like getting a chance to work on applications is one of the best ways to at least gain an academic understanding of the cannabis industry and really see all of the pieces and how they have to fit together, because these applications are like they're like more than blueprints. They're basically like the script for how for the ultimate movie that ends up getting produced. They're the regulatory kind of spinal column that attaches all of these disparate pieces that have to fit together in order to be a business. And in states like Florida, you're bound to them. Like they're actually part of the regulatory structure that you're going to have to operate under. And so I really appreciate you coming on and kind of fleshing the industry out. And so if the people want to reach out and connect with you, Ryan, what's the best way to do that?
The best way is to reach me by email at rfingerhut@globalgo.consulting.
Ryan is a great guy. He's a great consultant, great application writer. If you're in the industry and you're looking to acquire skilled people in that area, definitely check out Ryan at Global Go. You will not regret it. Ryan, thank you so much, and we will talk to you next week. As always, stay compliant.